The Raiders have their initial 53-man roster set that is very fluid and subject to change. But we'll talk about the big moves, hear from some of the players, and the GM, Tom Telesco. That plus more on Wednesday's edition of the Locked On Raiders podcast for August 28th, 2024.
You are Locked On Raiders, your daily Las Vegas Raiders podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome in, Raider Nation, to another edition of the Locked On Raiders podcast. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen of the day. Make sure you subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast to get the latest edition of the show as soon as it becomes available. As always, if you're checking us out on YouTube, you know we appreciate that. The show continues to grow each and every day, and that's because of the support of you, Raider Nation, and because of my man, Ari. Ari does a great job each and every day making sure we're on YouTube. We're looking good. We're sounding good. We shout him out. We appreciate him. He's on Twitter at Ari Produces. You can check me out as well at your boy Q254. And we got the Locked On Raider podcast voicemail line at 707-654-4693. Plenty of calls and texts, as you can imagine, on that Locked On Raider podcast voicemail line. We'll get as many in as possible coming up in segment number 3. Segment number 2, want to hear from GM Tom Telesco. He had a press conference around 2 o'clock Pacific time on Tuesday following the initial cut down to the 53-man roster. Again, a very fluid roster. It's subject to change. By Friday, it will look different than what it is right now. But he talked on Tuesday, so I have a few of the sound bites from what he had to say, some stuff that stood out to me. We'll do that in segment number 2. We'll talk about it here on the Locked On Raiders podcast. Here in segment number 1, just news and notes, and we'll just go over the roster, the way it stands, and some of the designation that the Raiders put out there for the players that they did move on from. Again, initially moved on from. We'll get into that after I tell you about the title sponsor of the show, which is Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time. Funny quick story about Game Time, and I'll tell you about them later on in the show. On my radio show on ESPN, it's called Game Night, and I closed out one of the segments. I said, that's coming up next here on Game Time on ESPN Radio, and my guy Emmett Golden was like, Q, the show's called Game Night, and I was like, man, I called it Game Time, didn't he? He said, yep. I said, yep. That's that Game Time stuck in my head. That's that really good sponsor, the title sponsor of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. So there you go. Game Time is stuck in my head. But let's get into the Raider conversation. The Raiders get down to an initial 53-man roster. They had to have that done by 1 p.m. Pacific time on Tuesday. And, some names have started to leak out even early in the morning. Some names were leaking out about some guys that were moved on from. And, a lot of them will revert back to the practice squad. But I wanted to go over some of the designations before I went over some of the names really quickly. Guys that are waived, there's different designations. There's waived guys, there's released guys, there's waived injured players, and reserve injured list designated to return. So, and then waived physical players as well. So there's a lot of different categories, and sometimes everyone just thinks it's all the same. Like, oh, that guy just got cut. No, there's different designations, and so a lot of times people don't really know what it means. So, waived guys are guys that have 4 years or less service in the NFL. They must clear waivers before they can sign back with a practice squad or just sign with any other team. Any team 1 through 32 can select them within 24 hours. They have that to get it done. So the Raiders, for example, are 13th on the waiver wire. So say the Browns let somebody go and the Raiders are interested in them, and they have to clear waivers. The Raiders will have the 13th opportunity to pick up that player. Now, if that whole cycle goes 24 hours and none of the 32 teams pick that player up, that player is free to go sign anywhere he wants or sign with any practice squad he wants. But if you're going to get a guy off of waivers, you've got to put him on your 53-man roster, and you've got to go in the waiver order. So the Raiders are sitting there at number 13. It goes in your draft order. And if you do get a guy, like say the Raiders could sign a guy and get him off waiver, claim him off waivers, then all of a sudden they go to the back of the line. So those are waived guys. They're basically young dudes, 4 years or less in the NFL. Release players, guys that are free to sign with any team, any practice squad immediately. They've got enough time served in the NFL. So they're veterans. They're over 4 years in the league. Waive injured players. They refer to a player being waived with the injury designation. It works similarly to a waiver, but if no team claims a player, they return to the waiving team's injured reserve IR list. So Jeff Foreman, that happened to him earlier. He was the guy who got hurt in training camp, had to get the air cast put on his knee. And obviously no team was going to pick him up. So he reverted back to the Raiders injured reserve IR list. Then there's the reserve injured list designated to return. Player that is on a short-term IR has to miss at least first 4 games of the season. Basically, it's the PUP list, right? Remember I kept saying the Raiders have till August 27th to go ahead and make sure JPJ is back in the mix and Colton Miller as well. They were both activated from the PUP list, so they don't have to miss the first 4 games. But anybody that is on the reserve injured list designated to return have to miss the first 4. And the Raiders had one guy, and I'll go over that in a minute. And then the waived failed physical list. So real quickly, I'm not going to go through all the guys that they released, but I will go through the guys that stand out. The waived players, Carter Bradley, the quarterback. So matter of fact, the Raiders, they moved on from both their quarterbacks, Nate Peterman and Carter Bradley, but Carter Bradley was waived. Matthew Butler was waived. He was a guy that's been waived before and put on the practice squad. He was a guy that Dave Ziegler had drafted and a big defensive tackle out of Tennessee. And he got a sack on Friday night against the 49ers, but kind of figured it was too little too late. Let's see who else got waived that stands out. Charles Snowden. He was the guy that got waived. I was actually surprised by that. It was a guy that I thought was going to make the initial 53-man roster. He had really showed up throughout the course of training camp and even the preseason. Dalton Wagner, the former tackle from Arkansas. He was a guy that was put on IR last year. He was a guy that they were pretty high on, but he just couldn't stay healthy, and that's been the name of his game, really going back to Arkansas. He just, the health. But, I mean, he's a big fella, 6'8", 320. So you thought that, man, maybe he was going to be able to carve out a role, but they ended up waiving him. And then Sam Webb, they waived him as well, the cornerback. And I was actually surprised that they did that just because of the depth that we've been talking about here of the cornerback position. So he was one of the guys that stood out to me that got waived. The released players, Nate Peterman, as I mentioned, both quarterbacks were moved on from. Nate Peterman was released. He's free to sign with anybody. Cornell Washington, Alex Bachman, Zach Gentry, Jalen Guyton, Nate Peterman, and Christian Wilkerson. Christian Wilkerson was a guy that a lot of people were surprised by because he's a really good wide receiver. But as I mentioned before, he doesn't play special teams. So not really a big surprise that they moved on from Nate Peterman and Christian Wilkerson, probably the 2 big names right there of guys that were flat out released and they can sign with anybody they want to as of right now. Waived, injured the following players: Corey Luciano, Ellerson Smith, Ron Stone Jr. Really, Ron Stone Jr. just stands out to me because he's got history with the Raiders. His dad played with the Raiders as well, so that's really the only reason that he stood out to me. Guys that were placed on the injured reserve list that are designated to return: Trey Taylor, the 7th-round pick out of Air Force, a safety, so he's going to miss the first 4 games, no doubt about it. The one guy that didn't end up on the IR list, the designated to return, was linebacker Tommy Eichenberg, which was really good. I thought he was going to be a guy that was going to end up on that list. That just lets you know that the lower leg injury that he's suffering from and he's dealing with right now is not as bad as it could have been, or they would have put him on that short-term IR just to free up a roster spot if nothing else. And then waive physical, the following players: Darian Butler, linebacker. He's been out for the longest. He was a guy that tore up his knee at the end of the regular season last year and hasn't been able to come back. So, again, the whole list of guys that have been released or waived or, designated for IR to return, you can find it anywhere, Raiders.com. I don't want to go through the whole list with you. It's kind of boring just to rattle off a bunch of names, but I did want to talk about, something that we talked about on yesterday's show, surprise moves. My surprise moves that I was looking at on Tuesday's show. I thought that a surprise cut was going to be Dylan Lobby, and he was going to end up on the practice squad, and Andrews Pete. Both guys are on the 53-man roster as it stands right now. Dylan Lobby, the 6th-round pick, running back out of New Hampshire. As many people said, I don't think he's going to get cut. I don't think he's going to get waived, Q. I think you're looking too much into it. Well, clearly you were right. Tom Telesco and company like what they see from Dylan Lobby. I was a little surprised only because, he didn't do anything in preseason, but he is a guy that I think has ability, and I'm excited to see what he could bring to the table. So those are the guys I thought were going to get released, Dylan Lobby and Andrews Pete. Neither one of those guys did. Guys who I thought were going to make it, Tyreek McAllister and Amari Gaynor, I put those as an easy answer, kind of 1A and 1B. And then Charles Snowden and Janarius Robinson. Charles Snowden did not make it. Janarius Robinson did. Kind of a no-brainer. So then guys that you look at that actually got let go: Charles Snowden, as I mentioned before. Sam Webb, talked about him. Both quarterbacks, Peterman and Bradley. And then guys retained Dylan Lobby and Brandon Faison. Brandon Faison actually kind of surprised me because he hasn't had any real playing time, any really burn, man. I mean, he's always injured. He was banged up for the majority of the 2023 season, came back at the very end of the season, missed a lot of training camp because he was injured. He was at practice on Tuesday, but he hasn't really had too much burn at all. So I was actually kind of surprised that they did keep him. But I guess similar to what I thought they were going to keep Sam Webb for, cornerback depth is why they're keeping Brandon Face on. A lot of these guys that have been let go, either waived or just flat out released, a lot of these guys are going to return to the Raiders practice squad. You can have 16 guys and you can protect 4. And you can have vets on the practice squad as well. 10 guys on the practice squad must be rookies, or second-year guys. So young dudes, rookies or second-year guys, and 6 can be veterans. And remember, 4 guys you could protect. So 16 guys out of all the guys that were let go. And matter of fact, Tom Telesco mentioned it. Yeah, it's a 53-man roster, but we're also adding 16 guys to the practice squad. So really, it's a 69-man roster. So a lot of these guys, you think about it, they were at 90. They're technically going to get to 69. So as many as they let go, it's really only going to be in the 21 guys that they formally let go and don't see coming back. Finally, here in segment number 1 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast news and notes of the day, I wanted you to hear from a couple guys that did make the 53-man roster, and these are guys that spoke at practice or after practice on Tuesday. Safety Chris Smith talked, Tyreek McAllister, the wide receiver, obviously punt returner as well, and linebacker Amari Gaynor. So here's Tyreek McAllister on going to the CFL and how big a deal that was for him as he worked his way back to the NFL, and then there's a follow-up as well. So here he is. I believe this was a question asked by Vinny Bonsignore.
Took a chance on yourself by going up to Canada, but and who knows how that would have worked out. But in retrospect, now that you look back on it, how big was that for you to kind of open some people's eyes in that league?
I feel like it was very big. You know, I would say probably the most important decision I made in my life to go into Canada, because I knew when I was in Denver, you know, I didn't get to play in the preseason, so it was tough for teams to really evaluate me, knowing I hadn't played and just going off my college film. So making that move, it was difficult, but I feel like it was the best decision I ever made in my life. So
there's been some players who've had great careers coming from the Canadian League. Warren Moon and Jeff Garcia, just to name a few. Did you take inspiration from any of the stories from guys that jumped from the Canadian League to the NFL?
I do. I watch a lot of guys around the league that's been in the Canadian Football League, like Alex Singleton, that's in Denver, and also D. Alford, I think for Atlanta Falcons, he played in the CFL. So I watch those guys and the success they have now in the league, and I just kind of, you know, figure I can have the same success if I come here and just do my work, do my job. So
there you go. There's Tyreek McAllister talking about going to the CFL and how that was the best decision that he made, right? Because he needed to do that. And, you know, he was seen, he was, you know, showcased, and that's what helped him get his way back to the NFL. And then here's Amari Gaynor on any anxiety, and then there's a Dreams follow-up question. So this one also is a question that is asked by Vinny, and then Vic Tafer follows it up. But Amari Gaynor, the linebacker, he called the defense all Friday in preseason game number 3, led the team in tackles, and earned his way onto the 53-man roster. Not a big surprise, but it was good to see that his hard work was rewarded. So here's Amari Gaynor talking about if there was any anxiety, and then there's a question about his NFL dreams as a follow-up.
First time you've gone through a situation like that, was there any anxiety or nerves today, or did you feel pretty good about it?
Yeah, I mean, I let my play speak for itself and give it all to God. I mean, that was the main thing. You know, with faith, there's no fear. So, I mean, that was the main thing for me, just to, you know, stay where my feet were and just keep working and keep grinding, and everything else will shake out. So,
at what point growing up was NFL a thought in your mind?
Yeah, so my dad played for Florida State. He played receiver. And just growing up, you know, seeing my dad, how hard he worked at Toyota, at the, car dealerships, I always knew, I wanted to play football for the rest of my life. So, I mean, that was the main thing for me. My dad played with influential people like Deion Sanders. He invited us to the Hall of Fame, and I got to see the whole experience while I was a kid. And I got to see, a lot of the guys talk, Shannon Sharp, Marshall Faulk, and a lot of those guys, and, see what it took to get them there. And, I mean, ever since then, I knew that's what I wanted to do. And watching, 30 for 30 videos, seeing, legacy guys. So, I mean, just put in that work, so I'll be in this position.
I loved his answer, Amari Gaynor, talking about no anxiety, right? I mean, he trusted himself, he trusted in God, and he did his thing, right? I mean, that's really all you could do. Trust in your abilities, believe that you know what you're going to go out there and do it, right? And be where his feet were, and that's the only way to do it. Hard work always pays off, always, 100% of the time, right? It might not be your time, but it will pay off on time. But if you don't put in the work, it's not going to pay off. And he absolutely 100% put in the work, similar to Tyreek McAllister, and that's why those guys are on the 53-man roster. Coming up in segment number 2, we'll do a little bit more deep diving into the roster, the initial 53, by listening to what GM Tom Telesco had to say on Tuesday following the initial cutdowns. We'll do that coming up in segment number 2 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. We'll get to that after I tell you about the title sponsor of the show, which is Game Time. Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks. It makes getting tickets for your favorite live events easier. They filter out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Matter of fact, Game Time Picks, it makes it easier to save on sports, concerts, comedy, theater, everything. They've got all-in pricing. They got seat views, the lowest price guarantee, Game Time ticket coverage. Your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticket industry. What you need to do right now is take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. The terms do apply. Again, create the account, use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL, that's LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. All right, Raider Nation, here we go. Segment number 2 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. Want to let you hear a little bit of sound from GM Tom Telesco. We don't get to talk to him very often, but of course, with the 53-man roster being set, at least the initial 53-man roster being set, he was going to meet with the media, and it worked out really well for me. He actually met with the media by way of Zoom right at 2 o'clock Pacific time. And that's when my radio show, Unnecessary Roughness on Raider Nation Radio 920 starts. So literally we started the show with GM Tom Telesco. And not only did we do that, but I got greedy. I told my man Ari, I said, look, this is what I want to do, and this is how we're going to work it out. I not only want to air this press conference live, I also want to be on the press conference to ask questions. So I was actually able to ask the first question in the press conference and the second to last question in the press conference. And believe me, somehow, some way, Ari, I always give him a lot of credit. He did a lot of the work behind the scenes. He was able to make it happen. So it was a fantastic way to start the show. Right at 2 o'clock, boom, get hit with the GM Tom Telesco talking about the cut downs, what went into some of the thinking. It was fantastic. So I was really happy that it worked out really well. But there's a couple sound bites that stood out to me the most. So I want to go ahead and jump right into them here in segment number 2 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. And the first one is actually the question that I asked. As you look at the Raiders roster as it sits right now, they have 7 linebackers and 6 wide receivers. That, to me, has a lot to do with special teams. And so I asked him about that. You'll hear the question and, how it pertains to the 53-man roster, but a lot of it has to do with special teams. So here's my question to Tom Telesco about the roster and special teams. Hey, Tom, thanks so much. Coach Pierce mentioned the other day that special teams was going to be a big-time priority when it came down to the 53-man roster, and with the number of linebackers that are on the roster and with the number of wide receivers and young wide receivers that made the roster, it seems like special teams and maybe even the new kickoff rule played a major role.
Well, it could. I mean, just roster-wise, this is kind of the starting point of where we are. But, yeah, I mean, a little bit heavy at linebacker right now. But I think just across the roster, whether it was the new kickoff rule or not, as you get towards the back end between, 45 and 53, there has to be a pretty big special teams rule there for those players. So that always, you have to take that into account as you put this together for the initial list. But honestly, with the kickoff rule and the players that are going to be used in that fashion, we still have to see how it plays out now in the regular season when it's for real and see what teams are doing and see how it goes. But, yeah, this is just how it played out right now. Something that Antonio Pierce had mentioned on Saturday following the game on Friday night versus 49ers is that when it comes down to it, a lot of these decisions at the end are going to come down to special teams. So when I saw 7 linebackers, I know 7 linebackers aren't needed on the squad. You got Robert Spillane, you got Divine Diablo, Luke Masterson, Tommy Eichenberg, Amari Burney, Amari Gaynor, and Kanai Moaga. And really, Moaga is a absolute 100% special teams dude. Right, he's not a very good linebacker, and I don't want to say that where it sounds disrespectful, but he's not a guy that you're going to rely on. And the Raiders have had dudes like that before, right, that like they've had safeties, and I forget the safety that John Gruden had around for a while that everyone's like, why is he around? He stinks as a safety, but he was a special teams ace. That's what Maga is going to be. So he's not going to be a guy that's going to be relied on to be on the field too much. But, yeah, the 7 linebackers, and you heard Tom Telesco talk about, yeah, it's a little linebacker heavy right now. It is, but it always goes back
to special teams. The next soundbite comes from a question that Vinny Bonsignore asked Tom Telesco, and that was about the wide receivers. Again, I mentioned 6 wide receivers were kept on the squad: Devontae Adams, Jacoby Myers, Trey Tucker, DJ Turner, and then the youngsters, Tyreek McAllister and Ramel Keaton. So Vinny asked specifically about those 2 dudes. What went into the thinking to keep Keaton and McAllister on the squad?
Tom, specifically as it relates to wide receiver Ramel Keaton and Tyreek McAllister, they made cases for themselves in Costa Mesa and then certainly finished strong on Friday night against the 49ers. Can you talk a little bit about their growth throughout training camp and then the case that they made for 53-man roster spots?
Yeah, I think, both of them kind of showed, slow and steady improvement. I mean, that's kind of what it is when you're coming into the league as a young player. But you saw from the beginning of OTAs until that last preseason game that there's some skill there to work with. And the goal is, not to have, obviously you want to have the strongest 53-man roster possible, but to us, the practice squad is just as important. So we want to have the strongest 69-man roster as we can as we put this all together. But some of the things those guys showed, certainly what McAllister showed on special teams, which is going to have to be a role for these guys at the back end. And it was nice in that last preseason game, certainly for those 2 guys and some others, to play a lot of snaps. And I like how Antonio set that up in the 3rd preseason game where a lot of young players played a lot. I mean, these guys haven't played a full game, a lot of our younger players, since their last game in college. And the way the preseason is, and especially when we're going to play the starters early on, there just aren't a lot of snaps. So to get guys get a chance to get a lot of work, get in a rhythm of series after series, and to see those 2 guys perform in that 3rd preseason game was certainly important.
Pretty cool that some youngsters like that made the team, right? And again, it goes back to, and it sounds like, it's kind of wearing out the same subject, but it always goes back to special teams. I mentioned that McAllister, with all that speed he has, it'd be crazy not to have him on the roster. Someone will be right there waiting to pick him up. Right? The Carolina Panthers have the first rights as far as the waiver wire goes. They'd be the first team rated. Okay, boom, we'll take him. We'll pick him up off waivers because he's just got too much speed. And Keaton has shown the ability to play special teams as well. And you saw what he was able to do as a wide receiver on that final drive, in particular against the 49ers on Friday night. Again, that was a question asked by Vinny Bonsignore as we're going over what Tom Telesco had to say to the media following the initial 53-man roster cut down. The next one is expanding a little bit more on McAllister and his time in the CFL. This is a question that Paul Gutierrez from ESPN asked Tom Telesco.
Hey, Tom, when it comes to Tyreek McAllister coming in and translating his game from the CFL, how surprising was that? I talked to him after the game, and he talked about how much more compact an NFL field is than a CFL field, obviously. But did you see that translate at all into the way that he's able to see the game and see the field?
As a returner, you have to have some athletic ability, quickness, and speed, but you also have to have some feel and instincts to it. And I think he has that, and that's, either have that or you don't. But his big transition has really been as a full-time receiver. Just hadn't done it a lot. And if you guys were out there during OTAs, if you saw him in April and May, and you see him now, you see how fast he's come and getting more comfortable at playing that position. With running routes, having a feel for it, setting up his breaks. So it's been really neat to see. It's really cool to see young players, really invest in what they're doing, use all the resources they have and try and make a football team. And he's really gone above and beyond to try and do that. And, we'll see how the year plays out for him. But he's come a long way since, and these guys, hats off to Champ Kelly and the staff here that signed him before I got here. They saw something in him in the CFL. He was signed as a future before I arrived, and what those guys saw is what you're seeing on the field right now.
So a little bit more deep diving into Tyreek McAllister, and I think everyone is so happy for that dude. Everyone's happy for Ramel Keaton. You're always even more happy for the guys that are kind of long shots to make the 53-man roster, and that they put everything out there, and that's what they did. And that's exactly what they did in preseason game number 3. A lot of people always talk about the preseason and how they want to do away with the preseason, or these games don't matter. Why are we watching it? Why are you talking about this game? Because it does matter, right? A preseason game is what got McAllister and Keaton a spot on the roster. Yeah, training camp mattered, right? But they were able to do it against another opponent, and that's what really stood up and stood out, and there's another reason why they're able to stick on the roster. Just got a couple more sound bites for you real quick. The next one goes back to me. Another question that I asked Tom Telesco, and it's really about the vision of the team, right? It's something that Antonio Pierce has talked about quite a bit. He said, hey, me and Telesco sat down. We have a certain vision on what the team is supposed to look like, what it's supposed to sound like, what a Raider is supposed to be. So I asked him, and I know it's the initial 53-man roster. I know no games have been played, but is it starting to look like and starting to come together with the vision that AP and both Tom Telesco and him shared when they sat down and when he got hired? Tom, as far as the team in 2024, you said it's different than last year's team. You and Coach Pierce shared a vision of what you want this team to look like and be like, and I know it's only on paper and it's the initial 53-man, but do you feel like it's pretty close to the vision that you guys share?
Well, yeah, I mean, we have some players here that have that, have the vision we share, but we haven't played a game yet, so we got to see how things play out. Yeah, the shared vision of how we want to play on both sides of the ball, and really that vision is really the vision of your head coach. That's what you're building the team around, is his vision of how he wants to play offense and defense. You can't do that overnight. It takes time. But there are already a lot of players here when I arrived that fit his vision, and we're going to continue to add to that with this year and throughout the year. Because we talked about the roster being, this is the starting point, this is the initial 53. We all know it's going to change throughout the year. It could change in the next week, even before we play the opening game. So, we'll see how that vision plays out. Having a vision is great. We need to see it executed on the field. So that's the goal for week 1.
So of course he's not going to go in and say, yeah, this roster is exactly where it needs to be. But we all know that there was, like I said, a vision that Antonio Pierce had. And the one thing I've liked and appreciated about Tom Telesco is he said on multiple occasions now that the job of a GM is to put together a roster that the head coach wants, right? Go out and get the players that a head coach needs. Whatever he's trying to build this team to look like, that's the job of the GM to go out there and get. It's not AP wants this, but I want this because I know better. I love the fact that he's like, hey, I'm here for him. I'm here to help him out and make sure that we have the right players in place so they can go out there as a coaching staff and coach these guys up. That's what he said. He said that multiple times, and that is something that you hear from a veteran GM, a guy who's been there, done that, and knows what it looks like. And so I feel like that Antonio Pierce and Tom Telesco are definitely on the same page. Are they going to disagree on some players here and there? Sure, right? That's natural, right? You try to agree with somebody on everything. It ain't going to work. It never happens, right? It's just the nature of the beast. But to be able to share the same vision and have an understanding to be able to talk it out and come to an agreement on what they want to do, that makes a lot of sense. And that's the way that you want it to be. Does that mean that they're going to go win 10 games? No, they got to go out there and coach these guys up, and the players got to go execute it. But just knowing that they're on the same page is a positive as far as I'm concerned. The final question is coming from Adam Hill from the Las Vegas Review-Journal and also my sister station ESPN Las Vegas. And he asked about Brandon Faison. Again, a guy that I'm actually surprised made the 53-man roster just because he hasn't been available. But here's the question to Tom Telesco about Brandon Faison.
Hey, Tom, I was just wondering about the thought process, I guess, on Brandon Faison. I know you guys haven't seen a lot of him. I guess what kept him around, and what do you expect him to be ready for the season?
Yeah, I mean, Brandon's shown he's been a starting level corner in this league, so he's just had a tough run of luck the last couple of weeks. But when healthy, he's been a really good player. So kind of see how it plays out from there.
So there it was. I mean, the guy has the experience. He's been there, done that, been in the league for a while. He's a guy that's got the size, the physicality to be a really good corner, a guy that I thought was going to compete with Jacorian Bennett for that outside job across from Jack Jones. But because he wasn't available in training camp, it was just went to JB by default. Now, with that being said, JB earned it too. JB was playing really well in training camp. I thought he did a really good job in preseason as well. So I'm thinking that you're going to see a really big season from Jacorian Bennett. You just hope that Brandon Faison is healthy and available to provide depth. Because, again, one of my biggest misses this offseason, training camp, and preseason was, the depth for the cornerbacks is okay. Until I saw him against, other opponents. And I even said that to Lincoln Kennedy on Tuesday as he joined my radio show. And I said, man, that was my miss. I thought these guys were a lot further along by what I saw in training camp until I saw him against another opponent. He just laughed. He's like, no doubt, brother. No doubt. He agreed with me 100%. It's different when you see him go up against another opponent. But that's what I got for you for segment number 2. Wanted you to hear that sound from GM Tom Telesco as he met with the media on Tuesday, and I got really lucky. It worked out really well, and Ari did a great job making sure that was available, and we ran it live on Unnecessary Roughness on Raider Nation Radio 920. Coming up in segment number 3, what's your thoughts? 707-654-4693. How are you looking at this roster? What are you thinking about certain players in particular? We'll get your calls and texts coming up next on today's Locked On Raiders podcast. Here we go, Raider Nation. Segment number 3 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. Your calls and texts straight off that Locked On Raider podcast voicemail line, 707-654-4693. Let's start off with Raider X. He's calling to talk about the preseason being over and the cutdowns, waiver wire, and the way he thinks the Raiders will use Tyree Wilson. Here he is, Raider X.
Yo, Q. This is Raider X. Calling in on the conclusion of preseason. Really excited about, the roster cut downs, the waiver wire, seeing who gets released, seeing what's out there. I think another man's, I don't want to say garbage, but another man's, what they, throw away might be useful for us, at least in depth. Some concerns about that second is really key. I think the overall conclusion from what I got from the preseason is Tyree Wilson possibly will be an asset for rotational depth along the interior line. I don't think it's going to be his speed is not a factor, or his bag of tricks on the sides. I don't think he's got it. But I think he could be useful with his quickness for his size in the inside, and then also his power. But I'm very interested to see on how that all works out as they start using more schemes into the regular season, and you start seeing the chess game begin of how Patrick Graham's going to use these bodies and how they're going to rotate for specific advantage. So just get your feedback and see what's going to work it out. I'm excited to see what this coming week or the next couple weeks has to do with the Raiders roster. Raider X out.
Raider X, thanks so much for the call. I'm pretty pumped to see what the roster does, in fact, look like as far as when it's done, right? The initial 53-man roster is cool, but when it's all said and done, like Friday, Saturday, Sunday, once it's got time to settle and every team around the league, the team's already kind of combed through the waiver wire, that's what I'm expecting, and that's what I'm excited about, just to see what it'll look like when they're all said and done, the kind of moves that they'll make. Tyree Wilson, this season's going to be interesting for him, right? It's only year 2. He's healthy. He's coming along slowly, but he's got the tools to be a dominant player. We know that. He's got the raw ability. Like if the Raiders had waived him on Tuesday, he would have got picked up immediately. It would have been no doubt, right? As I mentioned Carolina before, I use him as an example. They would have picked him up immediately. They'd have said, yeah, Tyreek McAllister has a lot of speed, but that dude has got a lot of size. He's got a lot of strength. I mean, that dude could be a monster if we get him in the right thing. So he would have got picked up immediately. Never thought that he was going to get waived. I was interested in what the front office and the coaching staff thought of him. Obviously, they thought highly enough of him to not have him play on Friday night, which I thought he should have just to get extra reps. And, he clearly is a guy who made the 53-man roster. So we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens when they put it all together and see if he can put it all together. Raider X, thanks for the call. I appreciate you. Up next, got a text from Tim from Southern Oregon. It said, hey, Q, it's Tim from Southern Oregon. Since we haven't really seen the first-team offense perform, my question for you, do you think the first-team offense is a 30-point-per-game offense? At least last season, that offense output could Coach Pierce, at least last season, that's the offense output Coach Pierce wanted for the offense. Can this offense consistently generate 30 points a game or close to 30 a game? That's my concern for the team going into week 1. I haven't seen enough to convince myself the offense could put up 30. I'm interested in your opinion, Q. Go 1-0 in week 1, Raiders. Silver and black attack. That's Tim from Southern Oregon. And thanks so much for the text. And no, I don't think this is a team that's going to score 30 points per game. The Raiders averaged only 19 points per game last year. When AP got hired, he said, give me 24 points, right? I look at it like if you can get anywhere around 24 points a game, the Raiders are going to win a lot of games. Really is. And it's funny, on my radio show on Tuesday night, Greeny's always cutting for the Jets, and he was making a case where he said the Jets are the biggest threat to the Chiefs because, well, they have a really great defense, and their defense is going to hold opponents under 20 points a game. And, anytime that Aaron Rodgers has had a team that held opponent under 20 points, they were 35-2. So they're the biggest opponent and the biggest threat to the Chiefs. And my point was, yeah, Greeny, duh. Anytime that you hold any opponent under 20 points, you have a great chance of winning. More likely than not, you look around the league, 20 points. If you can't score 20 points, you're not going to win a lot of games. It's not the early 2000s when the Ravens were holding teams to 10 points and they were only scoring 11 or 12 or whatever, or 14, and they're winning 14-10. That's not these days anymore. Teams score points. So, yeah, if you can hold a team to under 20, you're going to win a lot of games. But that goes for any team, not just the Jets. And my perfect example of that was, and you can go back and check to see if I'm wrong. I know I'm not. But look at the Raiders' 17 games that they played. The losing team in every single game except for one scored 20 points or less? Go back and look. Go back and look. The only team that scored more than 20 points and lost in the Raiders' 17-game schedule in 2023 were the Chargers. And you know what their score was? 63-21. So that was a whooping. So that, 21 points that they scored, did it matter? No. Every other game that was lost, no matter if it was the Raiders losing or their team that they were playing losing, that team scored under 20 points. Yeah, or 20 points or less. So, yeah, great. That doesn't mean the Jets are going to be the only ones that are threats to the Chiefs, so I had to dog Greeny on that. Greeny ain't never going to let me co-host his show. He's going to be like, man, I'm tired of this dude talking trash about me. But my point is, no, I don't think the Raiders are going to score 30. And I don't think AP thinks they're going to score 30. I think that they are a 24-point-a-game team at best. I'm hoping for 24. Their probably reality, to be honest, Tim, is probably closer to 21. Right? I mean, that's just probably reality. This team is not going to be, in my opinion, an offensive juggernaut. They're going to be a ball control offense, a team that's going to try to run the clock, run the ball, to keep their defense off the field, even though they're the dominant ones, but, shut the door with the defense. They're not going to be trying to get into a shootout with opposing teams. That's not the way that this team is built. So 24 points max, probably most likely around 21. Just to keep it real. But, Tim, thanks for that text. I do appreciate you. Got a call from Jacob in Ohio. He's calling to talk about his story of how he became a Raider fan and also wanted to give some thoughts on Tyree Wilson. Pretty passionate call here from our guy Jacob in Ohio.
Hey, this is Jacob from Ohio. Recently moved to Arizona. There was no reason for me to be, there's a million reasons, but everybody asked me, like, how are you from Ohio and you're a diehard Raiders fan? Well, I had an uncle that absolutely loved the Bad Boys. Loved the silver and black. And so, he cared about football more than anybody else in my family. And naturally, I was just like, well, that's my team too. And that's how it spreads, and that's how it's going to spread, and that's how every Raiders fan should be spreading it to their kids, their nephews, their nieces, anybody that they come across. Be like, man, the Raiders are the best. Spread the word. Let everybody know that the Raiders is where it's at. But I just wanted to give recognition to two different people. Tyree Wilson, yeah, we drafted him 7th overall. I'm not a fan of calling him a bust or whatever that may be, or considering trading him. I don't think that is anything close to what we should be doing. He doesn't have quick hands. He's going to have to work on his hands. He's going to have to work on getting off the ball faster, so on and so forth. But that man can crush a pocket, and he is a freak athlete. And so, yeah, he was 7th overall, and everybody thinks that he needs to be Myles Garrett. No. Yeah, that would be nice, but at the same time, the kid, what is he, 23, 24 years old? Maybe? Maybe? I haven't looked it up, but for God's sakes, give him a minute. He's not, and if he doesn't end up being as good as Myles Garrett, that doesn't make him a bust. He's still a freak of nature. That dude is so much more athletic than everybody. He's so big. All he has to do is put one arm out and put his hand on the chest of the tackle. And yes, he doesn't know how to get off of blocks, but at the same time, he can drive a tackle all the way to the quarterback's toes, to a point that they have to back up right into who? Malcolm Kuntz or Max Crosby? Come on, man. He's not a bust. I don't want to hear that. He's not a bust.
Jacob, thanks for the call. Appreciate you. And yeah, I think you're right about the tools that Tyree has, right? We know he's got the tools. We just don't know when he's going to put it together. Not calling him a bust. I'm definitely not calling him a bust at this stage. I'm actually a guy that was really high on Tyree. I hope that everything works out. He's just slow to the party, right? AP has said it. Adam Butler said it. Multiple players on his team have said it. He just is going with baby steps right now, where he's got to at some point step up and really be that guy. You know, the problem is that when you're drafted in the top 10 in the first round, your expectations are to be a game changer immediately, right? It was the same thing that happened to Cleve Farrell. He was drafted 4th overall, way too high. If he was drafted at the back end of round 1 or maybe early round 2, expectations wouldn't have been there. But since he was there, that's the problem. Alex Leatherwood, as bad as he was, who, by the way, he just got released by the Chargers on Tuesday, if he had been drafted in the 2nd round, late 2nd round, maybe early 3rd round, not a problem. But since he was drafted in the 1st round, number 17 overall, all of a sudden those expectations were that much higher. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone's firing shots at Tyree Wilson. I think everyone wants him to succeed. It's just frustrating seeing him not develop as quickly as everybody would like. You know, we live in a microwave society. Everyone wants to see everything done in 90 seconds or less. That's just kind of what it is. But Jacob, thanks for the call. I do appreciate you. Got time for one more text. This one comes from Raider Duck. It says, hey, man, it's Raider Duck tapping in from the North Best. Ha. I've texted about this before, but I'm going to continue to beat this horse. Tyree Wilson is best served to play nose tackle or interior line. I know from experience that you can surprise a guard by being a quick guy on the inside. I was a small dude at the time, and I racked up 5 sacks in a game in Pop Warner because the coach knew I'd have the first step on the guards. That's what experience has always stuck with me in life, and I've always wondered why they don't do it more in the pros. Just look at the now retired Aaron Donald. His biggest knockout of Pitt in the draft was his size. I think that ended up being one of his advantages. Move Tyree inside and keep him there. Thank you, Q. Raider Nation for life, Maine. That's from Raider Duck. Hey, thanks for the text. I do appreciate you. And yeah, I think that could very well easily end up being where Tyree plays on the inside for every reason that you just mentioned. They did that for him at the end of last year, and you started to see some results. AP is talking about Justin Tuck. When he was early on in his career with the Giants, that's where he played because he was faster than the guards as well, and he was able to scoot past them, right? And so that very well could be his spot that he ends up staying at. I'm not mad at that decision if that is what they choose to do. That wouldn't be a bad idea, right? But again, they're going to try to work it. They're going to try to develop him and see what best suits him. But I just would like to see them find one spot where he's comfortable and he can just dig his heels in and get after it. We know he's got the long arms. He can stop the run. He can get after the quarterback. There's a lot of good things he could do. Most likely, you're probably right, Raider Duck. The best spot for him would be on the interior. So thanks so much for that text. I do appreciate you. I guess I got time for a couple more. Sorry, Ari. This one's Cheese Grater Raider. He's calling to talk about Amari Gaynor, a guy who made the initial 53-man roster and shared his thoughts on him. Here he is, Cheese Grater Raider.
Hey, what's going on, Q? What's going on, Raider Nation? This is Cheese Grater Raider. I'm calling out of San Jose. And I want to talk about Amari Gaynor, someone that you mentioned on today's show. It's going to be yesterday's show if you get this call on. But I was paying close attention to him during the game, but mostly because, you know, when you're watching him during the game, he's got hands on hips, he looks fatigued, and, you know, you're thinking like, man, this guy's tired. Like, he hasn't had his conditioning, you know, he didn't get his conditioning right for the game. But he's out there making play after play after play. And it's like, man, this guy, he could have like a, you know, he's a developmental guy, but he could have like a Max Crosby motor type of guy. Like, this guy just didn't quit. I guess I just want to know what you thought about that. I mean, I know you mentioned him in the show, so I know you have some intrigue and some interest in the guy. But I think he's a guy that we should keep for depth because, like I said, he's a developmental guy and he's got that motor. He's got that, you know, you can tell he was out there wanting to make this team. He wanted to make the roster, and you know, you could tell that ball means a lot more to him. I felt like than just a paycheck, at least for his first 4 years, at least, right? Like, you're out there to get that first paycheck, really, and then you know whatever you do after that is whatever. But anyways, Q, want to hear what you got about that. Go Raiders.
Thanks so much, my man. I appreciate you. And yeah, I mean, he was definitely out there working to ensure he made the roster. And I feel really strong that he's going to be a guy that's going to be a factor on defense in 2024. He's not going to just be a special teams dude. He's going to be a guy who's going to play and contribute on defense in a major way. He seems like one of those diamond in the roughs that the Raiders seem to find, right? I mean, you mentioned Max Crosby. Maybe he's going to be Max Crosby-like, but at the linebacker position, I think the Raiders are set up really well with Amari Gaynor. I feel really comfortable with what he can do, and he's a young dude, a rookie, right? I mean, that's a good thing, and I think that he's going to show and prove exactly who he can be on defense. Thanks so much for that call. We'll close out with a text from Dirty in the 330. Says AQ is Dirty from the 330. Thoughts on getting Ritter? Simple as that. I say yes. Short but sweet. Desmond Ritter, who was drafted by the Falcons, was released. The Cardinals went and got him, and then he just got released on Tuesday, so he's now out there and available, looking for team number 3. I have to disagree with you with all due respect. I don't think that Desmond Ritter is that guy. He's now on team number 3 or looking for team number 3. I just don't think he's that dude. If anything, he'd be a project. I just don't think that he's really worth it. And I believe that if the Raiders bring in another quarterback from outside the building, they have to believe that he's better than what they have currently in the building. That's why they didn't just go draft anybody. Tom Telesco said, we didn't see anybody and have anyone graded higher than the quarterbacks we already had in the building. That's why we didn't go get anybody. So the guys that they had available in the draft, the guys they were looking at that were graded higher, they went before they had an opportunity to pick. So I don't see it. Maybe they do and say, hey, he could be a project. Maybe they look at those 4 quarterbacks in Cleveland and wait for one of those guys to get released and try to turn them into a project. But I just personally don't see it. But again, that's just me. But thanks so much for that text. I do appreciate you. And Ari, thanks for dealing with me. I know the show went a little bit longer than it's supposed to, but I mean, we're talking about the 53-man roster, the initial one. So, got to get a little OT and a little overtime, right? But appreciate all the feedback. Raider Nation, of course, will continue to update you as the roster evolves, right? There's a few more practices this week. We'll talk to AP coming up on Thursday. That'll be the first time we get to talk to him since the, the initial 53-man roster was put together. Who knows what kind of tweaks will be going on at that point. But, of course, we'll bring you any of that sound. That's following Thursday talking to AP, so that'll actually come up on Friday's show. But news and notes tomorrow, more calls and texts, and plenty more conversation about this team as it's putting together and now getting ready for September 8th and their trip to L.A. to take on the Chargers. So until tomorrow, Raider Nation, take care of yourself, take care of your family, love on your family. Most importantly, as always, just win, baby.